Well, there are some people that have like unusual birth or baby stories, and I don't know if you're one of those people, like, like you're speeding to the hospital and you're running through every red light on the way, and maybe you get an escort as part of it. I don't know. I did know a gal who actually gave birth while on the way to the hospital, so I don't know if anybody can replicate that one. There are other things like, being in labor for like, feels like 4.5 years. I'm sure it's not that long, but like you have this continued thing. I think I'm going to just steal one of these because nobody wants to give me a stand this week. So I'm not bitter about it or anything, okay, Chris? Just want you to know. So we'll just make do with this. But or maybe like I had a friend who passed out while his wife was giving birth. Seems kind of weak, doesn't it? She's going through all that, and anybody else that can relate to that, maybe. But yeah, he passed out. So she's trying to give birth, and he's lying on the floor in the delivery room there. I've also, like, my mom, changed names at the last second when I was born, and so the doctors or nurses or whoever asked her what my name was going to be, and she said Brent, and my dad was like, well, never heard that one before. And so that's part of my baby story there. Maybe you had the story like, you were expecting a girl and you got a boy, and it's like, oh gosh, maybe we shouldn't have painted the nursery pink unless we were sure. And so you've had to go back and recalibrate. Maybe anybody like this, you had a birth on Christmas. Any Christmas babies here? Anybody give birth to a baby on Christmas? Okay, yeah, Jill Knuth is actually a Christmas baby too. So she and Jesus, they share the same birthday. That's pretty cool, isn't it? How about this one? Anybody give birth in a barn? Well, okay, so, Jesus gets to be all on his own on that one. But we have a lot of these unusual Christmas stories. I don't mean Christmas stories, baby stories, but some of them happen around Christmas, including my first daughter actually arrived on December 6th. So she's our Christmas baby, Allie. She was born on December 6th, and December 12th, she was baby Jesus in the church pageant. And so she got an early career that. But the story I want to share this morning involves my second daughter, who was born in July. And so actually not exactly about her birth. It was about 2 weeks after she was born. And I went down so she was born in July, so I grabbed Allie, who was like 2.5 at that time, and I went to the store. I don't know what I was going to the store for, but I'm sure it was the hardware store because it's the only store I really go to. And so we went off to the store and left Kelly at home with this little 2-week baby. And we got back about an hour later, and there was a car in our driveway, and I recognized it as Frances Thomas, and she was a friend of ours from church. And I'm like, well, that's odd. I wonder why Frances is here. And so I go into the house, and there lies Kelly, sprawled out on the living room floor. And I'm like, okay, that's a little bit odd. Well, this is the days before cell phones. So what had actually happened is my wife was cleaning out a closet, set down some magazines, and she stepped on one of the magazines unintentionally, and you know how they're slick. Well, her feet slid out from underneath her, and she injured her ankle, but like severely. And so she managed to somehow crawl down the hallway to where the telephone was, because it's still attached to the wall. And it was sitting on a ledge that was probably about that high. And somehow she's crawling on the floor and managed to get up to the ledge and called the only person she could think of, who was Frances, who lived about 3 blocks away. And so Frances so I come in there, and there's my wife, and there's a 2-week-old baby. And I was like, she's like, I think I broke my ankle. I'm like, okay. And I'm like, well, can we get you up and get you to the car? And she's like, I don't think so. I'm like, well, let's try. And so we picked her up, and she passes out. I'm like, well, this is not good. And so I'm like, I don't know how to do this. And so we just called the ambulance. And so the ambulance came and picked up Kelly. And Allie was still somehow attached to me. But the baby had to go too. So they all went down to the hospital, and they got him checked into the hospital, and they told him, here's what's happened. And they just looked there, so you sprained your ankle, huh? And she's like, no, I think I broke it. I doubt it. And so they just kind of pushed her off into one of the bays there where they're waiting. And it was several hours, actually. And Kelly's like, I am in so much pain. And they're like, oh, you're going to be fine. You're going to be fine. And finally, after about, a couple hours, 3 hours, 8 hours, only seemed like 24, whatever, they took her into the emergency, and the doctors decided to do an x-ray, and they're like, oh, Like, we better get you into surgery right away here because you have a broken ankle. And Kelly's like, I could have told you that 4 hours ago if you've been listening. But they rushed her into surgery, and they did this, put a plate in and 6 screws and fixed her all up. And I still remember that because they had to admit her that night, and they weren't quite sure where to admit her because it wasn't just her. It was this 2-week-old baby that was with her through most of this that was going on. We did rescue her from surgery. But they're like, we don't know, we can't put you back in maternity because you've gone home and you got this baby. So they actually opened up the whole pediatrics floor for Kelly and Lindsay that night. And fortunately, though, and they brought in the nurses that had to staff it, but they had a couple emergencies that came in that night, so we didn't feel quite so bad about it. But I still remember this, the next week after the surgery, and we went back to see the orthopedic surgeon, and he puts up a x-ray on the screen and says, here's what this looked like, and here's what we did. And so I could look at this x-ray, and it has this plate, I don't know what the plate is, 4 or 5 inches long, and he said, and we put in 6 screws. And I'd always heard that, that we put in screws and people break things. I didn't really understand what screws looked like. They looked like screws. And I'm looking at that, I'm like, well, I should have just brought those home from the hardware store. We could have just picked her up right there. And but I'm looking at that going, oh, that's really interesting. And so, she is all healed up and today still has that. And I would like to say, how they talk about how you go through the things in the airport and you set off the things? She never sets it off. I always do, and I have nothing in me. And I have never broken a bone or anything. And but she's the one who makes it through. But I'm sharing that story here because I think sometimes Christmas works a little bit like an x-ray. And it's like on the outside, we're all happy and bubbly, and life is good, and Merry Christmas, and let's have parties, and let's do jingle bells, and let's just have a sleigh ride. And I love this sleigh out here, and I love watching the kids climb all over that sleigh over there. But it's just this happy, jolly time. But if we could actually take your life and push it up to the x-ray machine, what we would see there is brokenness. What we might see there is some scarring. What we might see there are some things that are going on the inside that reflect a lot of hurt, that maybe reflect some disappointment, that some frustration. But we have this happy outside of Christmas, and we have this, if we could see through to the inside, we'd see a lot of trauma. And I share that story because we've been looking at 4 people. And we've looked at 2 so far. We're going to look at another one today and look at another one next week as well, who are in the Christmas story, but in the Christmas story in a little bit of a unique way. And we've mentioned this, that they're outsiders. They're mentioned in Matthew's genealogy, where Matthew goes through and goes, here's the whole birth order thing for Jesus starting here. And this guy was the father of this guy and had a son, and it works its way on down. And Matthew interjects these 4 women into this list. And we've said that these women are kind of outsiders to the Christmas story. First of all, because of their gender. Like genealogies, that was a man's world, that was a man's list. And Matthew's like, I'm going to interrupt the man thing here, and we're going to slide in these 4 women here. And so they're outsiders gender-wise. And in a world that was really slanted in a man's direction, Matthew steps back and says, let's make sure that we insert these. And not only were they women, they were of different races. Probably all of them were non-Jews. We know that Tamar and we know that Rahab we talked about last week, they were Canaanites. Ruth we're going to talk about today, she was a Moabite. And Bathsheba, we're going to talk about next week, and she possibly was a Hittite. Her husband was. And so they're all racial outsiders. And so we have the king of the Jews coming here in this kingly line that Jesus is going to be born in. And Matthew's like, but let me just point out that not everybody here was a Jew. And so they were racial outsiders too. That's a good reminder to us to be careful and to be conscious of people who may not look like us, live where we do, have our same cultures, customs. They're part of the story too. And then we said that they were moral outsiders. Each one of them had a sexual failure somewhere, an immorality in their story, with the exception of the one that we're talking about today. And there's a little bit of her story that's like, that's kind of, I'm not sure I would have done that. But Jesus came for the outsiders, but he also came, and I'm starting to realize as I've been studying this, that those three things stick out. But each of these women suffered what I would call significant trauma. They had something that came into their life that was like, boom, and that they had to deal with. And you can go back a couple weeks ago to Tamar, and you think about what she went through. She lost not one but two husbands. She was abandoned. She was almost dragged to her death. And then she, what she had resorted to in order to get Judah's attention, I mean, that woman had been through some trauma in her story. And we looked at Rachel last week. And we looked at Rachel in her profession as a prostitute, and we're like, okay, there's trauma there. And a lot of times people, even in that industry or business, it's trauma to start with that leads them down that path. And we can assume that there's trauma. And we get to Ruth today, and her story is not quite as scandalous, but there's still incredible trauma, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. In Bathsheba, there's more trauma there than you might realize, but these traumatized people. And so if we're honest, a lot of times we look at our story and we've been through some trauma. Their story and your story are very similar. Here's what else I noticed about them. They were all underdogs. Like if you looked at these four women and you heard their stories, you would look at them and go, oh, they're probably not going to make it, or things are not going to go well for them, or I don't really see this working out. And yet, we see that somehow they become heroes in the story. So this underdog situation to start with, they end up being hero enough that Matthew says, oh, you need to make sure that you consider these women's stories when we talk about Jesus and his birth. So how did that happen? Well, I think it's this. They were all fighters. And I love this. You don't see in any of these stories where they necessarily sit around and feel sorry for themselves and say, oh, woe is me, and it's just over for me. They get up and they fight and they take courageous risks. And I would describe them as fierce warriors. And I love that about them. And so we see these things in their story as well. And we're going to see it again as we get to Ruth here. And I'm going to start reading in chapter 4. So I want to invite you to turn to the book of Ruth. The story of Ruth is 4 chapters. There's no way in the world we can read through the whole thing. We will read some portions of it this morning. But we're going to be in the book of Ruth the whole time. But Ruth chapter 4, starting at verse 18, and I'm going to read this quickly. It says this is the genealogical record of their ancestor Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron. You might remember him because he was the son of Tamar. Hezron was the father, Perez was. Hezron was the father of Ram. Ram was the father of Aminadab. Aminadab was the father of Nahshon. Nahshon was the father of Salmon, who married Rahab that we talked about last week. And together, Salmon and Rahab, they were the father of Boaz. We're going to talk about in a minute. Boaz was the father of Obed. Obed was the father of Jesse. Jesse was the father of David. Now, this looks familiar because it's almost identical to what shows up in Matthew chapter 1, except all the women have been extracted out of this list here. And that would be normal. And this is what you would expect to find even in a book like this. And some people think this was even put in later. But it was just to say, hey, this is all part of the story of the Messiah that's coming down here. But I love the fact that this is a story that's not talking about all these men. It's talking about this woman named Ruth, who ends up marrying this guy named Boaz. So let's look at her story and try to identify why God maybe included her story in the Christmas story. It starts with a husband and wife. And this story almost could sound like one of our Hallmark stories of today if you just kind of changed it around a little bit. But there's this husband and wife, Elimelech and Naomi are their names. They have 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. They live in Bethlehem, which is Judah. But there's a famine in the land. And so they pack up the family and they move off to a foreign place called Moab, and they decide to live there. And the kids grow up there, and as they get older, they both get married. One marries a girl named Ruth, and the other one marries a girl named Orpah. Well, by and by, Elimelech, the father of this clan, he dies, and so leaves his wife Naomi with these kids. And the one son's wife dies, and the next son's wife dies. And so we have these 3 women there, all widows. So Naomi, who's in Moab, and then they have these two Moabites, Orpah, and we have Ruth. And this is where we kind of join the story. And they're in a horrible situation here because as widows, they had no place in society. So they're kind of pushed to the margins, but they didn't even have a way to necessarily take care of themselves. Especially Naomi, she's a foreigner there. But even Ruth and Orpah, maybe they can go back to their families and they'll take care of them there. But you remember we talked about that levirate law back in the story of Tamar. It doesn't apply because there's no sons here. So they're really in a desperate situation. And so Naomi kind of does the only thing that she knows to do. She says, I'm going back to where I came from. And so she starts on her way down the road. And her two daughters-in-law with her, and she turns around and looks at them and says, don't go with me. Do you know what I'm going back to? I'm going back to widowhood here where, I got nothing. And, I don't have any more sons for you to marry. That's not going to work. If you come with me, you are subjecting yourself to a really pitiful life. Go back home. And so Orpah's like, okay. And she goes back home. And Ruth says, nope, I'm coming with you. And it's this crazy thing that she says, I'm going to go with you. And you can read about it in Ruth 1:16-19. And these are familiar verses. And we hear them sometimes, but not in the proper context. But this is the story. Ruth replied, verse number 16, chapter 1, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. And maybe you've heard those verses before, like at a wedding ceremony. Like your God, my God, whatever else like that. That's fine. If you had it at your ceremony, I don't have a problem with it. It's just not what it's talking about. It's talking about the situation where Naomi's leaving and Ruth says, don't go without me. And then she says something really amazing. She says, in fact, I want to turn away from all these gods that the Moabites worship, and I want to worship your God. And actually, in your Bible, you may see in verse number 17, the Lord there, it's written in those little capitals, depending on what version you have there. And that's basically what Ruth is saying is Yahweh, Jehovah. That's who I'm choosing at this time too. And so she makes a huge faith choice, but they go on to a place called what? Bethlehem. And if Bethlehem sounds familiar, we've sung about it this morning, we've read about it this morning, and you're going to hear about it in the Christmas season. But at this point in the story, notice this. Ruth, she has nothing. She's a widow, she has no husband, she has no kids, she has no means to support herself. It appears she might have family there that she could go back to, but she's not really interested in going back to them. So that makes you wonder about that situation too. She's got nothing. And because she has nothing, she becomes somewhat of a nomad. She gets displaced. She's leaving Moab and she is going to a place that she's never been before. She's that desperate. And so she comes to this place where she is a refugee or where she's an immigrant. Pick whatever word that you want there. But she comes into this place hoping that she'll be accepted. But she's going to a place where she's headed to a place where she's going to be a nobody. And maybe even less than a nobody. Because she wasn't even an Israelite. Naomi at least had that much going for her. Ruth didn't even have that much going for her. So she's got a situation where everything is stacked against her. Where if you didn't know better, you'd look at that situation and say, oh, that poor girl. She's just going to have a horrible life. I mean, I guess she's got her mother-in-law, but I mean, nothing else. I mean, she's going to, and what happens when her mother-in-law dies? I mean, she's going to have nothing. And so everything is stacked against her. She's in a no-win situation, but she wins. And the question that I have for us this morning is, okay, how did she do that? How do you take somebody who's in a situation this bleak and this bad and this hopeless, and how does she figure it out? And how does she come out on top, if you want to say that, with the trophy, with the crown, whatever? Well, it does turn out that she has a few things going for her. And as we look at our situations in life, sometimes we're like, okay, I'm in a no-win situation, or this is kind of hopeless, or I don't think this is ever going to work out, or where you feel like everything's stacked against you. There's some things from Ruth here that we can learn that might be helpful to you. The first one is this. We learn that she has noble character. And it's in verse number 11. It's Boaz who's speaking, and we're going to talk about Boaz a little bit more later in the story. But this Boaz guy says, "And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do all that you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character." This is your reputation, and this is crazy. So she comes to this town as a stranger, and after just a few months have elapsed, he says, "You know what your reputation is around town here? You have incredible character." So let's talk about that idea, though, character. A lot of times we're like, everything's like, I can't make this work, and nothing's going my way, and I'm just frustrated, and everything I try falls apart. Okay. But what's your character? How are you handling this adversity? What are you doing with this situation? So we see Ruth's character as we go through the story, and we resume the story with Ruth and Naomi. They arrive in town, and they don't have anything except evidently they find a place to stay, but they don't have anything to eat. So Ruth's like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go off to the fields here around town, and after the harvest goes through, the gleaners, this was Jewish law, the gleaners are allowed to go around and pick up whatever these people, the harvesters leave behind. So Naomi, I'm going there. I'm going to go find us at least some scraps that we can eat. And so she does that, and it just demonstrates her resourcefulness. It demonstrates her determination to go off and do that. We read about it in Ruth chapter 2, verse number 2. Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." And Naomi said, "Go, my daughter." And she went out, and she entered the field, and she began to glean behind the harvesters. And it turned out she was working in a field belonging to Boaz. I just mentioned him, who was from the clan of Elimelech. That was the father-in-law of Ruth there. Just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters and said, "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they answered. And Boaz asked the overseer of the harvesters, he's like, "Wait a minute, who's that? Who does that woman belong to?" But this is Ruth, who's had a chance to walk away from her mother-in-law but doesn't, and says, "You know what, I'm going to be faithful and I'm going to be loyal to you. I'm even going to pack up and move with you to a country where I don't know anybody." That demonstrates some character. That demonstrates some selflessness and some devotion. And when they arrive in Bethlehem to start this new life amongst strangers, she shows incredible resiliency. Okay, wait, what do I do? Okay, I think I can go off here in the fields. And she goes off in the fields, and she shows determination and industriousness and resourcefulness and even humility. And so much so that Boaz walks into town and says, "Wait a minute, who's that?" And it shows us a second thing, actually, too, and that is what? That she just didn't have character, but or was of noble character. She also gets noticed. And before we go into that, let me just stop for a minute here. Like, sometimes people say, like, adversity grows us, and I think that's true. Sometimes hard times come into life, and it's a time where we're challenged to grow in that situation. Other times, adversity reveals us. And where we're going through something, in the way that we respond to it, the way that we handle it, it just shows what we're made of. And I think the latter is really what you see here in Ruth's story. Maybe the adversity grew her, but we definitely see that she's going through this hard situation. And what we see of her is like, wow, look how she's handling that. I'm not sure I'd handle it the same way. I'd probably be feeling sorry for myself. I'd probably be like, oh, man. And she's like, okay, what do we need to do? Okay, let's go out and let's get doing that. And that gets her notice. We keep reading there in chapter 2. Boaz asked the overseers of his harvesters, who does that young woman belong to? And the overseer said, she's the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters. She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now. She's been working all day long, except for a short rest in the shelter. So Boaz calls Ruth and says, hey, come here. My daughter, listen to me. Don't go glean in another field. Don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for you or for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I've told the men not to touch you. And whenever you go thirsty, they have water. You can get water from their jars. And at this, she bowed down her face to the ground and said, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner? And Boaz said, I've been told about what you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother, your homeland, and came to live with the people you did not know before. And so this owner of the field says, who is she? And the answer is, well, it's Naomi's daughter-in-law. But why does he want to know? It's because of her noble character. But then she gets noticed. Boaz asks, who is she? But there's another interesting question, I think, to add to the conversation. It's, well, who's he? Who is Boaz? And evidently his character was pretty good too. Because he's like, hey, stay in my field. I'm going to protect you. Hey, make sure you leave extra there so when she's picking it up, she gets plenty. Hey, you know what? At another point in the story, she says, take some extra home for your mother-in-law, okay? But she is noticed. And I don't think we should do things necessarily to be seen. But I do think this, when you do the right thing, it's probably likely that you're going to be seen. And sometimes they're like, you know what? Why do I keep fighting? I just want to give up. And just go with the flow and whatever. And it's like, no. Just keep doing the right thing, because eventually, maybe the right person will walk into your story and see you acting as you should, showing good character, and that may be your ticket to wherever it is that you need to go. But even if nobody else does that, you know who does show up in your story and see? God. And so Ruth has chosen this God, but then she goes out there and this character, and God sees her selflessness, and God sees her work ethic, and God sees her concern for her mother-in-law, and God sees her humility and the respect that she shows. And I would say that for you, for me, as we sit here this morning, God sees. And you're like, okay, I'm just fighting this battle and I can't win and I'm so discouraged and I so much want to quit and just throw in the towel here. And the message this morning is, God sees you. And He knows. He knows all about your story. He knows what's coming next. It's not over yet. But she gets noticed by God, but also by Boaz. And so the story goes on. She comes home. And she tells Naomi, hey, here's what happened today. I was in the fields and this guy comes in and he says, hey, stay in my field and I'll protect you and we'll make sure you get plenty extra. And Naomi's like, well, who is this guy? And she says, his name's Boaz. And Naomi's like, oh, you're kidding. Boaz? And Ruth's like, you know him? She's like, yeah, he's a relative of ours. And Naomi, all of a sudden, it all comes together in her mind. It's like, oh, how did you end up in that field? You just went and picked a field. And yet, somehow, Boaz was the owner of that field, who's related to us, and that matters a lot in this story. And so we see this going on back and forth a little bit, evidently, where Ruth goes in the fields and gleans, and there's this kind of this relationship between Boaz and this foreigner, and where there's a friendship, but not necessarily there's a whole lot more. And Naomi finally says, you know what, Ruth, we need to take the next step. And Ruth's like, okay, what? And she says, well, it's time for the threshing. And they go down and they do all the threshing there. And then the men do the threshing of the crop there. And then they sleep there overnight. And here's what I want you to do. Go down there, and when everybody goes to sleep, you sneak in and sit at the end of Boaz's bed. And if he notices and wakes up in the middle of the night, and so she does this. And Boaz sits up in the middle of the night and he's like, wait a minute, what are you doing here? And this is chapter 3. You can read this. But to simplify what's going on here, Ruth has basically showed up to say, I'm Ruth, and I'm proposing, would you please marry me? And that is literally what's going on in the story. Okay, you talk about taking a big risk right there. This girl, this Moabite, walks in and says to Boaz, he's like, what are you doing here? I thought I'd come because you need a wife. And Boaz is like, okay, like, well, let me work on this. And he sends her home. And Naomi says, hey, what? Okay, you've done what you can do. Now you're just going to have to wait and see what God does. But I love this about Ruth. She has this, like, take no prisoners courage. Oh, that could have blown up in her face really, really bad. It could have been like, Boaz, like, you should not be here. And why was I even trying to help you? You're so rude and impudent here. No, she has this, okay, let's go for it. And she can join this list of people like Tamar and people like Rahab, and as we'll find out next week, people like Bathsheba, where it's like, okay, I'm just going to take that risk. And I love that. So what happens? Well, here's what happens. Boaz realizes that he can't marry her because there's somebody in the family who legally, by this levirate law thing, has the right to marry Ruth first. But there's also something, in marrying Ruth, there's this land that's associated with Ruth because of her father-in-law Elimelech. And it was Jewish law that you could sell your land, but it was still your tribal land. So if later you wanted to buy it back, the person who bought it had to resell it to you or sell it back to you. And that was even generational. So if your father sold land and you come back and say, you know what, that was my father's land, you could go and say, I want to buy this, and the person had to sell it to you. And so this is what Boaz is talking about in the story. He says, like, okay, I can't really marry you because of this land deal, and you're attached to the land. So he goes to this person and he says, hey, Elimelech's land, you can buy that back if you want. It's your right to buy it. And the guy's like, yeah, count me in. And Boaz says, but there is one condition. And the condition is this: when you get the land, you also get the girl, Ruth, who comes with the land. And the guy's like, oh, that's not going to work. And so he's like, how about Boaz? How about if you buy this field? And so Boaz buys this field, not because he wanted the field. He buys the field because he wanted the girl. So let's take some notes from this story here to wrap up this morning. The first thing is this: you will come to situations in life which cause a crisis of faith. And when I say crisis of faith, the idea is not that it's a horrible thing that's happening. It's that you come to an intersection where you have to decide what direction you're going to go. And Ruth came to that early in the story when Naomi is leaving town, and Ruth says, I'm going with you. She had a choice there to make. And Naomi stops and says, wait a minute, do you understand what you're choosing? And Ruth said, yes, I do. And she had a choice of faith to make. But we're going to face situations. First of all, will you choose to follow Jesus? That's an initial choice. But even in that path of following Jesus, we come to choices where we have to say, okay, am I going to do this my way, or am I going to do this God's way? Is it going to be my agenda, or is it going to be God's agenda? And we come to those moments and we have to take the faith path. So when we come to those situations, we choose God. Secondly, when you don't know what to do, just do what you know to do. And I realize that sounds a little contradictory. But the idea is this: is a lot of times we look at a situation like, I have no idea how to solve this. Don't try to solve it. And we talk about this a lot. Just figure out what the next thing to do is. So Naomi and Ruth arrive in town and they got nothing, maybe a place to stay. And it's like, okay, how do we, I can just see Naomi and Ruth say, how do we solve this? And Ruth's like, you know what? I think I'm just going to go find a husband. What do you think about that one? That's not how it worked. It was like, well, there's those fields over there, and I can go pick up after those guys, right? Yeah, okay. And you just take that step. And sometimes we paralyze ourselves because we can't figure out the whole big problem. Okay, what's a step that you can take? Can you go glean in a field? Well, go do that. And do the best that you can with that. And you never know. God will notice, but you never know who else might notice too. Thirdly, God often chooses the mundane over the miraculous. Do you realize there's no miracle in the book of Ruth? At least not obvious. But there are those like small miracles, if you want to call them that. Like just the fact that Ruth ends up in Boaz's field. Coincidence? Probably not. Or just the fact that Ruth's out working in the field when Boaz walks in, or all of the different details in this story, or just the fact that Boaz happens to be related. But those aren't really all that exciting. I mean, this is a pretty boring story, kind of. We could condense it down to this. Ruth goes to a foreign country, and she goes and picks up after the harvesters. And then everything goes crazy. But a lot of times we in our stories are wanting God to do like this miraculous thing. We want an angel to show up and to announce a birth. But I've never had an angel show up and never announced a birth. And yet God still works in our stories because he tends to choose the mundane over the miraculous. And maybe you're in a situation this morning where you're like, you know what, I'm trying to do the right thing. I even pray about it. My prayers don't even get answered. Maybe not, or maybe. But it's just so commonplace and just so mundane how God is arranging your path in life that you don't even see it. But God notices and God acts. But he often uses the mundane over the miraculous. Number 4, you can't live your life in safe mode. Faith is about taking risks. Faith is about doing your part and then sitting back to say, okay, what's God going to do? This is kind of scary. Okay, I walked in here, I sat down at his feet, he woke up, I said, hey, marry me. And here's what, she comes home and she tells this to Naomi in chapter, I think it's 3, verse number 18. Naomi said, okay, wait, my daughter, and let's see what happens. My guess is he's coming after you here. But she takes this huge risk. And maybe you're in a situation in your life right now, you're facing adversity, you're facing a problem. You're facing trauma and you're like shrinking back because it's overwhelming you. What's that step that's so scary that you're like, I don't think so? Because maybe that's the step that you need to take. Number 5, don't lose hope. And whether Ruth realized this or not, hope was still part of her story because somewhere in God's great design, Ruth was going to get married to this guy named Boaz, and they were going to have a kid named Obed, and they were going to have a kid named Jesse, and they were going to have a kid named David. You ever heard of him? That the Messiah would come through his line. So somewhere in the grand scheme of it, Ruth was going to be part of the messianic promise that goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden. That's a lot of hope. But Ruth didn't know all that. But sometimes we live without hope when we forget that there's a God of hope. And whatever your story is right now, it is a story of hope. Because yes, there can be trauma, but there can also be healing. And yeah, they may put a plate and 6 screws in there, but then you can look at that later on, and you can see how everything is healed up and mended. This is a story of hope. And then one last thought here. The baby changes everything. This story ends in chapter 4. Ruth marries Boaz, and they have a baby. And Naomi has a grandson. If you go back to chapter 1, Naomi's kind of seems like a lost cause here a little bit. In fact, she arrives in Bethlehem. She says, don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara, which means bitter, because God's been kind of rough on me. And yet this baby comes, and I can only imagine what Naomi's life is like. Oh, I got a grandson, yes! But Ruth, who probably thought she was going to spend the rest of her life as a childless widow, she has a son. Who has a son, who has a son, who has a son, who has a son, who eventually becomes Joseph. And I realize he's not the blood father of Jesus, but that's how Matthew traces his line, who has a son named Jesus. And the baby really does change everything. And you can look at the story of Ruth and you can see a little bit the story of Christ. How people are without hope and God says, oh, don't be with hope. Oh, I've got a baby here. I've got hope for your future here. And that's the story of Christmas. Let's pray together. God, I thank you for the story of Ruth, an outsider, somebody who's been through trauma, an underdog, but with what incredible moxie. I love it. God, I pray that you give us more of that hope, more of that courage, more of that determination, more of that willingness to get through the adversity to the other side. Our heads are bowed, our eyes are closed. I have two questions this morning. The first question is this. Have you come to that crisis of faith where you said, okay, I'm following Jesus, the one who came in a manger, but who died on a cross and then rose again for our sins? Have you ever placed your faith and trust in him? You can make that decision this morning where you sit, simple conversation, you and him. Jesus, I believe you came, died for my sin, rose again. Please forgive me, come into my life. Maybe you've made that choice, but you're at a different crisis of faith this morning, where maybe you want to give up hope, or maybe you're just so frustrated by your circumstances that you're feeling sorry for yourself, or maybe where you just kind of are ready to throw in the towel because you don't feel like it's worth it. What commitment do you need to do? What step do you need to take? Maybe it's just like paying some attention to your character. Saying, you know what, I can work on my integrity. I can work on my work ethic. I can work on my being dependable and responsible and where people can count on me. And maybe it's just like, I'm going to keep doing the thing that I don't think anybody's noticing because God does notice. I don't know, what is your choice? What is your decision that you need to make this morning? Will you make that commitment? If we just come and sit on Sunday morning and say, oh, that was nice, and we don't ever change, we're really wasting what God wants to do in our lives. So will you, at this crisis moment of faith, make a decision for whatever your situation is? So God, we come this morning encouraged by Ruth. We can relate in so many ways. We go through our own traumas. But God, we find hope in you that we can come out the other side. I pray for your help in that regard. Yes, it's in Jesus' name. Amen. Would you stand with me this morning? Thanks so much for coming. Hopefully you'll be back next Sunday. Bring somebody else with you. We'll be looking at the next person in this line. But would you stand and sing with us as we finish with one last song this morning?